Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to this episode of Shariah Intelligence. My name is Muhammad Nuruddin Lemu. I'll be your host, and with me to discuss today's topic, two of our top facilitators and trainers with the Da'wah Institute, Brother Nasir Bello and Sister Salatu Sulay. Assalamu alaikum, you're welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Today we'll be looking at this subject of certainty and how scholars try to search for greater levels of certainty, maximizing evidence, being very clear what they are certain about when it comes to the will of Allah and what they are not that certain about. They are presumptive, and there's a degree of speculation. I'd like to start by asking Brother Nasir Bello, what are the main considerations scholars take when assessing the level of certainty regarding a particular proof or evidence in Islamic law? They should be cautious not to speak in God's name where they don't have authority. How do they distinguish between what they are sure about and what is the product of speculation, of ijtihad, of human reasoning? What are the main parameters, criteria that they consider?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In trying to assess certainty of a claim, usually scholars are interested in two things. They want to look at the source and the authenticity, of course, of the source, and then the meaning and implication of the text or of the claim that actually has been made. And therefore, they want to establish whether the authority that this particular claim is associated to, can they establish the authenticity of that claim linked to him or attributed to that particular source, whether or not the information or the message or the claim is also clear, is another thing they looked at. And therefore, coming back to just like the metaphor of medical prescription, where first you ask, is it from a doctor, who is actually the source, because he is the authority that can give prescription. And now if that has been established or not, again they would want to see whether the message is clear or not clear. So the issue of authenticity of the message as regards to the source, and also the clarity or otherwise of the message. Now coming back to the Islamic sciences or the Islamic tradition, there are two factors that are actually in play or looked at when assessing truth or claim made. Usually they look at what we call thubut, or in terms of hadith sciences they say wurud, and that is about the authenticity of the text itself, be it Quran, be it Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they also would want to look at another element or another factor that is called dilala. And in the case of dilala, it is the final meaning or implication attributed to a particular text, considering the language and the context. So these are the two critical factors that are looked at when trying to understand and establish certainty of a claim. Now, the second thing that they look at is the degree of certainty itself, where they have what they call qat'i and zanni. This is sort of a spectrum, where the qat'i is the level, is the end of the spectrum that denotes absolute certainty about that particular claim. And the other end, and then you have zanni, which is speculative. Now, when it comes to zanni, there is sort of like I said, it is a spectrum. So the scholars, in trying to look at the gradation along the spectrum, they have different concepts or terms they use. For example, when it is 100%, they will say this is qat'i, that is, it has reached the level of absolute certainty. Now, anything below 100 or between 100 to around 70 or 75, that is what they call zan. And if it is 50-50, they use the concept of shak. That is, you cannot actually, it's not clear what is overriding, whether it is true or false, or that is, whether it is right or wrong. And anything below that, they call it waham. Sometimes they categorize the zan into what they call raji and marju. So what you call zan, in terms of it being above shak, is what they call zan raji. While anything that is below shak, that is below that 50%, they call it marju, and that is also synonymous with their waham. Anything at the range of the end of the extreme, which is called batil, that is at the stage of 0. So that is how they categorize, or they explain the gradation of, doubt and certainty in trying to establish certainty of a text in the Islamic tradition, or in the sciences of a tradition.
So what you're saying here is there's a whole spectrum from uncertain to certain. And what is certain is qat'i. What is uncertain, like completely uncertain, would be waham, just, wishful thinking. But then you have what is all in between. And dhan is what you say is more presumptive, where there's some evidence that this is true. There's a greater chance it is true than it is not true. It's presumptive. And you're saying the same thing applies to the meaning of the text, where they are certain regarding what it means, or there's a level of uncertainty.
Exactly.
Sister Salah, what more would you say on this?
Looking at those two factors and the 2 degrees, all evidence would then either be described as qat'i thubut or dhanni thubut, meaning that the authenticity, the connection between the piece of evidence itself and the authority to which it's ascribed is qat'i, it's certain, it's definitive. There is no uncertainty around that. Or that is qat'i thubut, or the authority to which it's ascribed, there is reason to some level of uncertainty as to whether that authority really established that thing. So if it's a hadith, for instance, there would be that level of uncertainty as to did the Prophet ﷺ really say this or really do this. That's on the level of the first factor, the factor of authenticity about the source. Then the second factor is the one to do with the meaning, dilala, and to that extent, every piece of evidence also would be classified as either dhanni dilala or qat'i dilala, meaning whether or not we, however we may view this source, if we look at the meaning itself, we would say the meaning is either categorical, it's very clear what these words imply, and that is the qat'i dilala, or the meaning of the words are presumptive. There's room for several interpretations. There's no definitive interpretation or definitive set of interpretation. So that's dhanni dilala. That's what I would add to that.
So even though there's a spectrum,
yes,
from absolutely certain, moving to lesser and lesser degrees of certainty, and so that's to do with, say, the thubut or wurud, the source, how close is it to the will of Allah?
Yeah.
Where we are certain this is Quran, so for example, that may be qat'i thubut, and other evidences may start falling on the other range of the spectrum. So even though there's a range, what you're saying is the scholars still draw a line of black and white.
Yes.
What can we categorically say, this is true with all certainty, and this, there's room for debate and diversity?
Indeed, yes.
I'd like us to look at the thubut one more closely. Just to go a bit deeper, Brother Nasir started talking about a metaphor with that of a prescription from a doctor. I guess looking at this question of where's the source of a prescription, how sure are we? What more could you say about this subject of thubut or wurud, as it's usually used when applied to hadith? What do we mean by that?
Okay. When we're talking about the concept of thubut, if I may use that same example or metaphor that Brother Nasir used, someone comes up with, brings a prescription and says, the doctor said I should take this number of tablets maybe 3 times a day, or I should stop eating such and such a food, or I should start eating this. If we're talking about the authenticity of the claim that the doctor said so, the doctor gave this instruction, then the fundamental question we'll be asking is, how sure are we that the doctor actually said so? Where is the evidence to support that claim? When we now apply this to the Islamic sciences and the sources of evidence, if we are looking, let's say, at the Quran, we would be saying, essentially, what is the evidence that Allah actually said such and such a thing? Are we sure? Is there enough evidence to establish that claim firmly? On what basis are we making this kind of claim? If it's a hadith, then we'll be talking about the same thing as well. Did the Prophet say this or didn't he say this? Now, all evidence, as I mentioned before, would fall on either side. It would either be its qat'i or its dhanni with regard to the thubut. Hadith mutawatir and the Quran are the two sources of evidence that are established to be qat'i thubut. There is no argument among the learned and the scholars about the authenticity of the Quran and hadith mutawatir. And we'll go further into hadith mutawatir, or simply put, multiple chained hadith.
So these are hadith that have so many chains.
So many chains.
That they are considered absolutely certain sources
Yes.
of truth.
Because of the
Quran.
number, yes, of narrations that support a particular statement, or the fact that it was said, the Prophet ﷺ said or did something. The number moves it from just people said to people said and it did happen. There are so many people in the chain that the probability of all of these people lying, or all of these people by some great chance coincidentally saying the same
So
thing.
the number of independent
chains, all strong on their own, and therefore being able to corroborate and strengthen one another, increasing the certainty and pushing it beyond what we know of in common law as probable doubt or reasonable doubt or shadow of doubt. So for that reason, hadith mutawatir and the Quran fall into the category of qat'i thubut. And the Quran itself, that's the reason why it's considered qat'i thubut, because the narrations that back up the Quran as we have it today are also independent, multiple chained hadith or narrations. Then all other sources of law, your hadith ahad, which is single chained hadith. Single chained is the common term used, but it means the number of narrations are so few that it calls to mind the probability that somebody may be erroneously making the statement. Somebody might have forgotten something, but it raises that doubt that moves it away from that certainty, what Brother Nasir described as, 100%, and shifts it into the area of, there is good reason to think this may be true. However, there is some quality about one or two chains, for instance, where they say at several stages in a chain of narration, you have just one person, meaning, how is it possible? How did this happen? So it raises that doubt. For that reason, ahad hadith are classified as dhanni thubut. So also are all the other sources that we mentioned in an earlier episode, ijma, qiyas, all of those. Some of them, for instance, maybe, let's take Ra'iyah Sahabi, a companion expressed an opinion. The fact that it said that particular opinion is dhanni thubut doesn't mean that the companion is a liar. It just means that just because a companion said, the Prophet ﷺ said by itself, is not sufficient for you to say he certainly said without any doubt. So that's the reason. And as we look at all of these individually, we'll understand why they all fall under that category. Let's not forget, we are talking here about sources of law Islamically, where a mufti or a jurist is going to make a pronouncement which could fall into fard or haram, make statements where one might end up saying that you must do A as a Muslim or as a human being. If not, Allah would be displeased. If not, there would be a consequence, divine consequence for it. So that idea of if you're going to speak in God's name is what makes scholars very careful to try to understand where does this fall in the spectrum. And as long as sufficient doubt is raised, they then say, okay, this is actually dhanni thubut.
So why would scholars seem to have unanimity on the authenticity of the Quran?
Good. When we look at the Quran specifically, I'm about to narrate certain things, but all of these are based on the number of scholars, not even scholars, before the scholars, the number of companions who bore witness to a series of things to do with the source of the Quran, the origin of it, the preservation of it, the steps taken to record and to conserve what has been recorded, and then to pass it down. So from the very beginning, we have at the point of origin, the Prophet ﷺ reported to have said he received this or that as revelation as part of the Quran. And there are many scholars, many of them, many companions, who were witnesses to these things, who repeated these. Not only that, when he received the revelation, that's the Prophet ﷺ, he taught companions. He taught those who memorized it. He instructed, write this down. And whenever the scribe would be done writing, he would say, read it to me, so that he can confirm that what he remembers as having been revealed to him is what has been written. And he would recite these verses in Salat whenever he led them, which was so many times that you can't count. Whenever, sometimes he gave talks after prayers, before prayers, or at various other events. So companions, so many times they would hear verses being repeated again, and they had memorized. They had many who had memorized these verses. These things were written down. So there was a consistency in that. After the Prophet ﷺ died, or let me even back up a little. Before he died, he actually stopped them from recording just his saying, because he specifically said he didn't want there to be any mix-up between what is meant to be part of the Quran and what is not. So there was already that effort to maintain the integrity of the Quran itself. After he passed away, during the lifetime of Abu Bakr, the Quran itself was standardized. Standardized meaning during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the writing was done in separate what we call volumes, which is really separate sections. So you might find there is a chapter written in this set of material, loose leaves, or scapula of animals. Then another chapter is somewhere else. During his time, you didn't have it as we have in a single volume, where you take up an entire volume of leaflets, and say, this is the entire Quran. During the time of Abu Bakr, what was done was that was now put all in a single volume. So that's one attempt to bring it all together, standardization of the volume.
So even though at the time of the Prophet, the whole Quran was revealed.
The whole Quran was revealed.
It was all written down.
All written down.
Everybody on his own writing his own
yes.
in that way.
But standardization was bringing companions together and sitting down and writing it in one volume. And confirming that what is in that one volume is corroborated by the memory of those who had memorized and by the authenticated writings already done during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So in that sense, you don't see a break in the chain. It's what was authenticated by the person who said, I was told this was revealed to me. That was used to back up what was now done. Then during the time of Uthman ibn Affan, we then had the standardization that had to do with the dialect, where you had more and more people accepting Islam who were not originally Quraysh or even Arabs. And they would then encounter words in the narrations that they had, or the written ones, or what they were taught, that were not in that Qurayshi dialect. Because the Prophet ﷺ had made the companions understand that in the entire revelation that came to him, there were certain words and terms that came from about 7 different dialects. So you had dialects collapsed within one book. That's the Quran itself. So you talk about variants. Now, when these people accepted Islam and they would hear something but that's not the dialect, I understand that particular word, it started to lead to some argument. Is this one of the words that the Prophet ﷺ authenticated or not? Now, you see, because they were becoming far removed from the place of originality, the original source in terms of time and place as well, it was giving room for arguments and confusion. That was what then led to the standardization, where certain companions were brought together and they would corroborate and cross-check with each other. This is what I remember. What do you remember? What do you remember? And if any of the companions at that point said, I remember this was the word, the dialect used in this place, and others would say, well, we remember something else, this single companion's narration will be treated as hadith ahad, which I mentioned before. Yours is alone, it's solo. We are not saying you are lying, but we are not sure how come yours is not corroborated by anybody else. And it's different from what the rest remember. That was how they then had what we know today of as the Uthmani script or Uthmani Mus'haf or Uthmani Quran. Now, when they had that volume at that time, it was then recopied. And copies were sent, there were about 4 or 5 copies. A copy was sent to each of some of the major cities in the Muslim world at the time. Then more copies were made from those ones. And it is those copies that we know for sure filtered across the world. As far as we know, the original Uthmani script, one of those first 4, we do not have any evidence that they are still in existence. But copies that are seen today, and by copies I mean leaflets, really the word mushaf, that are seen today, have been tested by experts, not even Muslim experts, using former methods of testing, but the most recent form of testing, carbon dating. And they found that they have copies that are said to be as old as the century in which the Prophet ﷺ died. The most recent one, that's the one in what they call the Birmingham copy in the University of Birmingham, is the one that said currently it seems to be the oldest mushaf in existence. And they examined the scripts, the writing, and they said, yes, they can see variations between that one and the Quran as we have it today. A lot to do with the marks, what unspoken words are written, such as the unspoken alif, that at that time they would not write it down, but we write it down today. So they saw variations as such. But they said when they look at the lexical form, the words, the core message, they actually can say this is very, very close to what we have today. And when they date it back, they date it to about within 50 years, and I'm being conservative, it's quite a bit closer than that, within 50 years of the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And they say this can say with, I think if I use the term we've been using here, with almost, qat'i certainty, that this was one of the copies made from one of the Uthmani scripts. So when we look at this entire chain, dating back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, what he did to maintain the integrity, how he passed it on, how careful those first caliphs were to preserve that integrity, to look for discordance and deal with it, and then pass it on, and what science is helping us reestablish and reaffirm today, we can see why scholars and those who study this would say that when it comes to the Quran, it is called a thubut.
Nasser, what would you add to this?
Just as she rightly explained, the Uthmanic version, which is called the Nuskha Uthmani, and beautifully explain also how it has become a mutawatir, established source. Scholars actually do say that other versions that are actually coming from other companions are regarded as riwaya shadha. They are those that are treated like ahad, narrations of a hadith, and also they don't have that divine authority that is associated or attributed to the Nuskha Uthmani. And in fact, to avoid confusion, confusing that with the Uthmanic version, that was why Uthman ibn Affan even tried to destroy and burn that particular, riwayat versions that are actually shadha. They don't have any divine authority, and therefore they are not legally binding. They are not used in salah and what have you. The version that has the level of yaqeen or tawatur, that you can say it is qat'i thubut, is that of Nuskha Uthmani, that has the needed corroboration that is required to establish something that is authentic, 100% yaqeen, like we actually described in the spectrum we earlier talked about, dhanni and of course yaqeen in terms of thubut.
Good. So when it comes to the certainty of the source of the Quran we have today, the historical integrity of the text, what you're saying is this is an area where there is no disagreement, not from the time of the companions of the Prophet, nor any other time in Islamic history, that while during the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said the Quran was revealed in 7 dialects. In other words, certain words within the Quran, you could actually see them within, these were in dialects other than the Quraysh. But by the time of the companions, starting with Abu Bakr getting one volume and insisting that this was in the Qurayshi dialect, and then by the time of Uthman, ensuring that was absolutely true, and copies of that being made, and any other dialect that might have been okay, this, what do you call it? It was one of those dialects that might have been allowed at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The problem that variety or variations of different versions, the problem that was creating was one that made Uthman decide, let us stick to the Tawatur version, the one that we have no doubt about. And these ones that are more solitary, less authentic, were dealt with as shaz. So the Quran we have today, as you've mentioned, not just from the thousands of people who memorized the Quran during the time of the Prophet, going into the future, the many who copied and the many copies that were made, all the archaeological evidence seems to suggest that beyond any reasonable doubt, the Quran we have today is the Quran that was recited during the lifetime of the Prophet. So on the issue to do with the wurud or the thubut of the Quran, we have no doubt regarding its authenticity. What about the question of hadith? How certain are we regarding the authenticity of hadith, Brother Nasir?
Well, in trying to establish authenticity, talking about certainty of hadith, you would find scholars coming with two levels of analysis and assessment. Usually the scholars of hadith will look at some parameters, or what we call elements in a hadith to establish its authenticity. They will first look at the soundness of the hadith. That is what they call the chain of the hadith, the chain of narration, how it linked to one another from end to end. That is from the time of the Prophet ﷺ to the stage of the scholar who narrated, who reported the hadith, maybe Imam al-Bukhari or Muslim or any other person. How is the chain? Is there any linkage? Is there any disconnect between them? And they have different names. They call such kind of disconnection. When there is sound, when it's sound in terms of the linkage of the rijal of the hadith, then they will say this is a very sound hadith. And the second issue they looked at is the integrity or reliability of the men that actually, or the men in the chain of the hadith.
Or women.
Of course, men in this context is referring to
Rijal,
because in the science of hadith they say ilmul rijal or rijalul hadith, but that does not necessarily mean they can be women. So basically the chain, the soundness or reliability of the people that actually narrated the hadith, what they call adalatul rawi, and then they also look at their memory, how sharp is their memory, that is the dabtul rawi. And beyond that, they also look at the content and the harmony between the content and the Quran or other more authoritative sources. It could be another hadith, or it could be even ijma or amal. So these are some of the things they looked at. But then if you come to the next level, where largely the scholars of usul are the ones that are actually looking at that, for them, as sophisticated as the science of hadith in trying to establish authenticity, or in trying to get to the level of certainty, they think the fact that it is a product of human effort, it cannot be divorced from this probability of human error. And therefore, there is a need for another layer of mechanism, another layer of tool or mechanism that will help take it further to establish this level of yaqeen. Because at the end of the day, as Sister Salatu mentioned earlier, it's about speaking in God's name. And therefore, scholars of usul are very mindful of that, are very critical of that. And that is why they talked about this issue of classification in order of certainty. They talked about whether a hadith is mutawatir or ahad after qualifying and becoming sahih according to the scholars of hadith. And therefore, a hadith that have different, line of corroboration in terms of, the narration, as she rightly mentioned, discussing about this tawatur, where you have many chains that are saying the same thing. It gets to a level of absolute certainty. And therefore, that one, they can say it is qat'iyu thubut. But the kind that fall within the category of what we call ahad. And of course, she also described what an ahad hadith is. We equally talked about it in the past, where we said a chain, that is a single chain from the Prophet to the reporter of hadith, could be gharib, which is a form of ahad. You may find another one which has that has actually two or three, which is called aziz, and you have another one that is between 4 and 9, according to most scholars, which is called mashhur. This class is put together at what we call khabar wahid or hadith ahad. So this category have some level of presumption in them, despite the fact that then can even get to the level of 99%. But the fact that it has that element of presumption.
There's an error margin.
Exactly.
Margin of error.
Exactly. So because of that, the scholars of usul are very cautious in trying to associate absolute certainty to it. And therefore they put it or they categorize it as dhanni thubut. And therefore they are mindful of what it could do in terms of application, particularly on issues around aqidah, or things that are related to things that are ma'lum min ad-din bid-darura, and even things around excommunication or associating takfir to a Muslim.
Ma'lum min ad-din bid-darura, what do you mean?
Okay, these are things that are fundamental of the deen. Things like the pillars of Islam, for example, issues around 5 daily salat, issues around hajj, issues around fasting, the month of Ramadan, and also issues around aqidah, the issues of articles of faith. These are the kind of things that scholars call ma'alum min ad-din bid-darura. That is the fundamentals that becomes obligation for everybody to understand and to adhere to as a Muslim.
Sister Salah, what could you add? Brother Nasir started on the basic principles that hadith scholars use to classify hadith. Is there a consistent chain of narrators? What do we know about the integrity and character of each individual in the chain? What do we know about the memory and how reliable are these people? But he also said the question of the matan, looking at what is the message of the hadith compared to maybe the Quran or other stronger hadith. And based on that, they would say the hadith is sahih. However, he then said, while a hadith scholar, and in that level, that's authentic enough to consider as authentic, because there's still a margin of error, since the whole system of assessment is a human one, and we don't have any promise from the Quran that Allah is going to protect a particular hadith, but we're looking at human beings doing what they do best, and the best they can do is to come up with something that scholars consider still dhanni. But in order to lift a hadith and be certain regarding its authenticity and its authority, they start to look at not just is this hadith sahih, but how many other sahih hadiths corroborate this one. And there he mentioned the single, solitary hadith, just one chain, 2 or more chains, 3 or more, or 4 or more, the mashhur, until you get to the mutawatir. That's the level where so many independent chains that there's certainty about.
Yeah.
So this is a fiqh, a classification more relevant to fiqh, and as you've said, for identifying the fundamentals of the deen. Could you discuss more on what exactly we mean by mutawatir hadith and what exactly we mean by ahad hadith?
Okay. Let me use a slightly practical example. Let's say you are an individual and you are reporting that the governor said, for instance. You said you were there when the governor said schools should resume on such and such a date. Now you give me that information, and I give him that information. And he passes that information to the cameraman, who passes it on to the principal. That is what we would call a chain of narration. Then let's say, for instance, there was another person who was there as well when the governor was reported to have said such a thing. That person tells his sister tells her friend tells somebody in the market tells a shopkeeper. That's another chain of hadith. Now we call this chain an independent chain of hadith, independent of the other chain. So when we have in the hadith independent chains pointing to the same thing or transmitting the same information independently, and the number is high, some would say the number has to be up to 4 independent chains. Some say 10, some say 12. There's no definitive cutoff point, but many enough that it becomes difficult to imagine how they could all be mistaken. If how or could they have gotten together an organized falsehood, as some scholars have put it. Where you have that level, then they will say this is mutawatir, when all the other factors, of course, have been taken into consideration. So we are talking about Sahih Hadith. It's already authenticated based on the other considerations that Malam Nasir mentioned. Those sort of Hadith then go into, they are classified as Hadith Mutawatir. If the number of chains, or let's say a chain has certain qualities, maybe this particular information is transmitted by just one chain, or just 2 chains, or just 3, but not just that it's a low number of chains. You look at the chains themselves and you find, let's say, in a particular stage, instead of having 2, 3 people, you have just one person. So it's you said, the governor said, he said, the governor said, he said, the governor said, but 3 of you tell just me. Now you have one person at that stage. That pushes it automatically. Doesn't matter how many other people I tell, pushes it automatically to Ahad Hadith. Or maybe at a certain stage it falls to just 2 people. Again, Ahad Hadith. Or you actually have just 2 people at this stage, but the number of people increases where the Hadith is now very common, very well known. Again, it's still classified under Ahad Hadith. It's just the Ahad Hadith now has different classifications. Now, we look at, let's go back to Hadith Mutawatir. It's possible that I'm narrating something and they say this particular chain you have brought forward is Ahad Hadith. But when you look at other Hadith, they support and corroborate this one. So the idea of a Hadith being Mutawatir depends on how many independent chains or how many chains are supporting and corroborating and thereby strengthening or reconfirming a message. I know inshallah we'll come back to this question of hadith and go deeper. But for the scholars, this is what is really important. They are looking at how many people are there within the chains of narration to give enough room for reasonable grounds or doubt, or for nearly 100 or 100% certainty about the information that's been given.
This is interesting. What you were saying was there isn't a very clean line regarding hadith that are ahad, especially the mashhur,
yes,
and those that are mutawatir. Some scholars would require up to 10. I think people like Imam Suyuti would say, if it's up to 10, then we can start calling it. Anything above that would be mutawatir. Some other scholars would say until it gets to 30 or 70, differing scholars. And the other point I think to bear in mind, because some people think hadith collection started during the time of Imam Bukhari or Muslim, like 200 years later, etc. Whereas what we find is earliest hadith narrations were actually students of the Sahaba at the time of Imam Zuhri, and then his students such as Imam Malik and the fiqh manuals. There's a key thing I think here, which is I think new to some who only have heard of hadith that is sahih and hadith that is not sahih. And I think a key thing to remind ourselves is that while that is good and it is useful, and nearly all the scholars use hadith that are sahih, they differ in how much authority they give hadith. And as you've mentioned, for establishing the fundamental essentials of the religion, fundamental aqidah, fundamental acts of worship, those fundamentals, scholars only depend on absolute certainty of Quran or hadith mutawatir, where you've got multiple independent chains at every level of every generation, or as they say, the first 3 generations, you had over 3 or more independent chains and narrators. I would like, Sister Salah, what would you say about the other sources? So when we talk about thubut or wurud, we are talking about the sources of evidence. Where is this evidence coming from? Is it Quran or is it Hadith? How do scholars categorize the other forms of evidence, such as qiyas and ra'i of a sahaba or amal ahl al-Madina, these other secondary sources of law that are used in usul al-fiqh as evidence or proof?
Okay. These other sources of law are all classified as being of doubtful authenticity, dhanni thubut. As I mentioned earlier on, it doesn't mean that the scholars are saying these things are false. It's saying that these ideas, let's say we talk about ijma of the scholars as a tool itself. It's saying scholars got together and agreed that this is the position in Islamic law. When we look at the ijma itself, the very idea of consensus of which scholars, is it scholars of a particular city? Is it scholars of a particular generation? And where is the evidence that indeed all the scholars of that city or of that generation were all of that single opinion? That question alone means it doesn't have the same unanimity that you get when it comes to what are the narrations or the narratives that back up the Quran or that back up hadith called hadith mutawatir. As you said, some scholars would say before they would classify a hadith as hadith mutawatir, they would need up to 10 independent narrations, or those who say they want up to 70. When it comes to something like ijma, the scholars, as it's often said in a sort of humorous way, do not have ijma consensus around what ijma really is. So that for it in itself would help us understand why the scholars will look at ijma as dhanni thubut. That's just one example. We take another one, for instance, qiyas, analogical reasoning, where a jurist says this situation has similarity to that situation, and that situation already has qat'i ruling on it. So we will apply that ruling to this situation, looking at the circumstances, the reason behind that ruling. But there again, you start to see variation of opinions among even the learned ones themselves, where some might say, well, when you say that is the illa, that is the idea or the concept behind the ruling, are you certain? Is that the only illa, or are there more? Or have you missed something? Or we don't see this situation as really being similar to that for this reason. So this the variation in opinion, the difference of opinion among scholars will then lead one to conclude that you cannot therefore say categorically that this should be the ruling on this matter. Because as we remember, ruling would mean they would have to give it one of those value judgments. Is it something that's haram? Or is it compulsory? Or is it disliked? Or is it just mubah? You can do, you can leave it, no consequence? Or is it makruh, disliked, or mustahab? It's good to do, there's reward in doing it. Because once we start speaking of reward and punishments, then we are speaking in God's name. So when the scholars cannot agree on certain things, it's another reason why they would treat the secondary sources as sources that are actually dhanni thubut. And we can look at each of the secondary sources and find the same factor playing up. Even when we talk about the major schools of Islamic thought, the madhahib, what is the difference among them? It's how much weight they give to these secondary sources. Which do they place before what? So we look at Amal of the people of Medina is not given the same weight in other schools as it's given in the school of Imam Malik. So right there, you cannot say this will establish Aqidah or establish the Muslim identity or the lack thereof, because it does not have that unambiguous, categorical, definitive connection to the source of Islamic law, that's Allah himself or the messenger, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Now, Nasir, what would you add to this issue of the authority of the secondary sources of law?
Well, I think as she rightly mentioned, they are all categorized under zanni sources. That means they have some level of presumptiveness in them. But then you would find their support for each other, increasing their level of certainty and of course reducing the level of presumptiveness or the zanni element in them. And just like the ahad narration or ahad hadith, you would find not being able to make a fard or wajib independently. According to some schools like Maliki and Hanafi, you would find other schools accepting them to make any kind of ruling, like you would find with Hanbali and to a large extent Shafi'i. And again, most schools will not consider secondary sources actually establishing what we earlier talked about, the fundamentals of the deen or issues around Aqidah, and they cannot, of course, have the strength to declare somebody a kafir, that is for takfir purposes. And again, these secondary sources, again, you would find different schools have a different priorities they attach to them and associate the kind of strength they associate with them also differ even in their equations. So that is how usually they look at them, while Hanafi will give priority to istihsan over maslaha, over thaddu zariya. You would find Maliki giving priority to amal over istihsan and many other tools. So all these secondary sources, as I said at the beginning, independently they cannot make a fard in wajib for Maliki and Hanafi, but for other schools they can do that, and their level of collaboration or support for one another actually increase their level of certainty and at the same time decrease their level of presumptiveness.
This is interesting. So if I were to look at it on the spectrum of certainty and presumption, or what one would say, dhanni is true, but we are not 100% certain, whereas qat'i is true and we are 100% certain. And so on the side of the qat'i thubut, we would have the Quran followed by the hadith mutawatir.
Yes.
So there you have absolute truth, sources of absolute truth. Of course, there's another thing, what exactly did the words of the Quran mean, which I'd like to look at in a second. But so on the spectrum, you have Quran and the hadith that are mutawatir, recognized by all schools of Islamic jurisprudence as sources of absolute truths, no doubt about that. It is when you leave those two sources, then you come to Ahad Hadith and Amal Ahl al-Madina and these other dhanni sources, where the schools of thought and scholars differ regarding which has a greater element of dhanni compared to the other. And so as you've mentioned, Maliki would consider Amal Ahl al-Madina as the next greatest level of certainty after Quran and Sunnah, but still dhanni. Another school, say the Hanbali, would consider Ahad Hadith. Another school would consider Ijma. And of course, as you mentioned, depending on the definition of Ijma. And that's how, each school ranks its evidence according to a level of certainty. But as you've mentioned, the fatwa or an opinion may be stronger if it has more dhanni evidence supporting it. In other words, it's still ijtihad, it's still dhanni, but with a greater level of certainty. Now, I think we are clear on the thubut, wurud issue, or the axis, if I use the x-axis, of authenticity, credibility, the integrity of the source, the historical, reliability that this is linked to the Prophet, with Quran on one side and and Hadith Mutawatir, and then the others on the rest of the spectrum. Now, when you look at any piece of evidence, so let's take the Quran or the Sunnah, how certain are we regarding the meaning, the implication? And I'd like Brother Nasser to contribute to this or start. How do scholars classify the level of certainty or presumption, and what do they mean by the dilala, which you mentioned earlier?
Going back to the metaphor of a doctor or the medical prescription, basically is around trying to understand what is meant. Is the meaning clear? what actually is the message that is being conveyed. Usually with text, you would find in most languages a spectrum of meaning associated to that. And the role or purpose of scholarship is to get closer to the true meaning and implication of a particular text. And the idea or the concept of dilala is about the concluding meaning and implication that is associated to a particular text after putting the language, the context into consideration. And that is why you will find scholars in the Islamic tradition having a variety of concepts associated with understanding meaning, what they call dilalatul alfaz. They want to know whether this is general or specific, or khas. They want to see whether it is open or restricted, what they call mujmal or mubayyin, mutlaq or muqayyid, for example. And they want to know whether it is specific, it is general, it is open, it is closed, whether the meaning is metaphoric or allegorical or is literal. They equally want to know whether it is implied, what they call ishara, ibaratun nafs or ishara. And all these are some of the concepts that they use. And that is why you would find wordings or phrases in the Quran or in the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam having a variety of meaning. And scholars will now begin to do ijtihad in even understanding in this context what does it mean. For example, when you look at the word sa'a in the Quran, it has a variety of meaning. In fact, in one verse you would find it having two meanings, where the Quran talks about وَيَوْمَ يَقُومُ سَاعَةً يُقْسِمُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ مَا لَبِثُوا غَيْرَ سَاعَةٍ, that on the day of judgment. So the first sa'a, scholars interpret it to mean judgment day, that those who are mujrimun will swear that they have never left, they haven't lived in the world more than just an hour, which is a different meaning or interpretation of the word sa'a. Like the verse of the Quran, إِنَّمَا الْمُشْرِكُونَ نَجَسٌ, for example, the word najas there, scholars have a variety of interpretation of what najas is. Is it a physical najas? Is it a spiritual najas? The issue of cutting the hand of a thief, for example, that the Quran talked about. Where are you supposed to cut? Is it this place? Is it is it at the level of the wrist or the elbow? What exactly? These are things that are not really clear. The verse which talks about hiraba and fasad fil ard. What is the limitation or the scope of the interpretation of the word fasad, for example? Is it robbery and kidnapping, or it can be extended to the issue of corruption as it is in our present day and age? So these are some of the examples. For example, you would find in the Quran where scholars will say there is zan in terms of the interpretation. It is not really explicit in meaning, and they employ this concept and these ideas to be able to extract and understand the meaning of the message of the Quran and Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
I think this point you're making, that language comes loaded with all sorts of meanings. You've given examples, and I know in just ordinary language, when you say what's the meaning of the word watch, when somebody says, well, watch could mean something that tells the time. Watch could mean to see. But when somebody says watch your back, it's not you should turn back and watch your back. But the context would tell us what it means. And you've mentioned, from a hermeneutical point of view, that words can take so many different meanings. One would then assume that, well, anything can mean nothing, ultimately. How do scholars narrow meanings down to ensure that the wording in the Quran is not just left to anybody's speculation and then everything is dhanni? How do scholars deal with this, Sister Salah?
Okay. The scholars use various approaches, and looking at the approaches that they use to help narrow down or pin down the meaning or the probable meaning of words actually relates back to what we had talked about in one of our early episodes, critical thinking and the role of reason in revelation. For instance, when the scholars want to assess or get at the meaning of words in a particular text, they would look at things like the historical context. So when maybe Allah said, catch them or kill or fight them wherever you find them, where he was talking about the interaction or the battle between the Muslims and the non-Muslims, including even whoever was against them. If one looks at the historical context, one would understand why the wording is in such strong language, such strong terms, that if you then bring such words out of that context, you separate it from the context, it will sound unnecessarily aggressive. It might even and has been used as basis for aggressive behavior on the part of some Muslims. So scholars would do that. They would let the historical context, what was happening at the time the verse was revealed, or at the time the Prophet ﷺ said or did something, they would use that to give them an idea as to what meaning should and could be ascribed to that particular text. That's one. They would also look at that same context and say, so when the words were uttered, what was the intent? What was the context or the situation that these words were meant to address? And use that to know whether the words should have the weight of something that is compulsory or haram or falls into something else in between. That's one approach, historical. Another they would do is textual. So they would look at the textual content. So it's not just this particular line of text that they would look at. They would look at other texts. They would look at what came before this particular line, what came after it, what else do you find in the text? And that is, if it's a verse of the Quran, for instance, we'll look at what else is in the Quran, what else do you have that would help shed more light on what this could or should mean. And based on that, so what value judgment should a scholar make? What ruling should a scholar make? Another thing they would look at is what's the textual commentary, because you would sometimes find that a saying of the Prophet ﷺ would actually be a commentary on a verse of the Quran, and you find that done so many times, such that this is what then helps companions or helps them equally make comments on verses of the Quran, on sayings of the Prophet ﷺ. So the scholars would look at, is there commentary from some other form of textual evidence? Or is there a commentary from a companion who would be basing his comments on what he knows and what he understands? Another thing they would look at is language and grammar, which is something that Brother Nasir alluded to. They would say, what is the linguistic meaning of these words as they appear? Or what does the grammatical structure as it is now, what does it mean? Because just a shift in the rules of grammar would naturally mean a shift in meaning. And you find that in all languages. Then another thing they may also consider is the maqasid al-Sharia. Because the maqasid al-Sharia, that is those fundamental aims of Sharia law, are based on multiple authenticated textual evidence. Therefore, if the particular translation or meaning that could be applied or drawn from text is in conflict with a well-established fundamental aim of the Sharia, then the scholars would know, okay, this interpretation may not work, perhaps not in this situation, and they would then look for other ways of interpreting it to align it with the maqasid. Ultimately, what scholars have done and still do is continuous cross-referencing of approaches, triangulation. They don't just go by, well, this is what it means grammatically, or this is what the context of its revelation meant. They would look at the context, the historical context, they would look at the textual context, they would look at historical intent, they would consider the maqasid. In many, many cases, I wouldn't go so far as to say every case, but in many, many cases, one thing that always keeps coming up, even for scholars, is to be sure that it aligns with the maqasid, because the maqasid are not based on solitary evidence, but on multiple evidence.
So this is all very useful, and the idea that the Quran is divine in its origin, but it's also in a language of humans that we are supposed to understand.
As humans.
Yeah, and it respects the grammar of the language it was revealed in. And by understanding Arabic, especially classical Arabic, and how the Arabs at the time of revelation understood the meanings of these words, how they used their grammar, and I guess that's why some consider studying Arabic poetry as something that helps see the various nuances in that's pre-Islamic, very early poetry, help understand how these words were understood in the context and at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, to see how did the Prophet understand it, how did he implement it. You bring an example of a verse that some would recite and say, oh, it says kill the unbelievers wherever you find them, but all you need to do is just read the context of the verse. Just go back to verse 1 and read to that verse, keep on reading, that usually clarifies it. Look at the sababul nuzul, the context during which this verse was revealed, its own historical context. It helps to clarify. Look at other verses in the Quran. It helps to clarify even further. How did the Prophet and his companions implement this instruction? Helps to reduce. So in other words, it's not just because it's in language, it could mean anything, and you can come with all sorts of hermeneutical devices to say it actually doesn't mean anything in particular, everything is dhanni. There are certain things that are qat'i. There are certain things where the scholars all conclude on one implication of the text after assessing all the evidence. They conclude this means this, or there's only one God, angels exist, the hereafter exists, murder is haram. So there are some of those things that come from very categorical texts, and there are those things that it's still part of what the Quran may describe as verses that are mutashabihat. They are allegorical or open to more than one meaning. Inshallah, next time I'd like us to come and look at each of these more carefully, the thubut and the wurud, and the level of certainty or presumption in each of them. We'll stop there, inshallah. We'd like to thank you both for your contributions. Jazakumullahu khairan. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.